The evening sky had turned a deep purple as General Thomas drove home. His shoulders ached from a long day at the Pentagon, where he'd spent hours in meetings about troop deployments and strategy plans. He loosened his tie and turned on some soft jazz, looking forward to finally getting home to his wife and kids. The headlights of a police cruiser flashed in his rearview mirror. Thomas checked his speedometer. He'd been driving exactly at the limit. With a tired sigh, he pulled over to the side of the quiet suburban road and rolled down his window. In his mirror, Thomas watched the officer approach. Something about the way the man walked, hand already resting on his holster, shoulders tense, made Thomas's military instincts kick in. This wasn't normal for a routine traffic stop. "License and registration," the officer said, not bothering with any greeting. His nameplate read, "Officer Wilson." Thomas nodded politely. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Thomas kept his voice even and respectful, the same tone he used when dealing with difficult foreign officials. Wilson's face hardened. "I said license and registration, now." Thomas nodded again. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket and then for my registration in the glove compartment." He moved slowly, deliberately, making each movement obvious. Years in the military had taught him how to handle tense situations. As Thomas reached toward the glove compartment, Wilson suddenly drew his gun. "Hands where I can see them," Wilson shouted, his weapon pointed directly at Thomas. Thomas froze, his heart pounding but his face calm. 28 years in the Army, 2 tours in combat zones, and now he was staring down the barrel of a gun on a quiet street just 3 miles from his own home. "Officer, I was just reaching for my registration as requested," Thomas said, his hands now raised and visible. "Get out of the car. Now." Wilson's voice had taken on an ugly edge. Thomas carefully opened the door with his left hand, keeping his right hand visible. As he stepped out, the streetlights illuminated his face clearly for the first time. Wilson's expression changed slightly, a flicker of something like surprise, quickly replaced by the same hard stare. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle." Thomas complied, feeling a burning sense of humiliation as passing cars slowed to watch. He was wearing plain clothes, dark slacks, and a button-down shirt, having changed out of his uniform before leaving the base. To anyone driving by, he was just another black man being detained by police. "I've done nothing wrong, officer," Thomas said calmly over his shoulder. "I'm an Army general returning home from the Pentagon." Wilson laughed sharply. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president." He patted Thomas down roughly, checking pockets. Across the street, a woman had stopped walking her dog and was now holding up her phone, recording the scene. Thomas noticed but kept his attention on the officer. "My military ID is in my wallet, along with my driver's license," Thomas said. Wilson pulled the wallet from Thomas's back pocket and flipped it open. The first thing visible was Thomas's military identification card, complete with his rank and security clearances. For a moment, Wilson stared at it, his expression unreadable. "This some kind of joke?" Wilson asked, his voice lower now, uncertain. "No joke, officer," Thomas replied, still facing the car. "I've served this country for nearly 3 decades. Now, may I please turn around?" A second police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. The new arrival was about to change everything, though neither Thomas nor Officer Wilson knew it yet. Thomas took a deep breath, his hands still pressed against his car. He thought about his family waiting at home, about his soldiers deployed overseas, about the oath he'd taken to defend his country. And here he was, being treated like a criminal for driving while black, even after reaching the highest ranks of military service. The second officer stepped out of his vehicle, walking toward them with a curious expression. What happened next would send shockwaves through the entire police department. "Step out of the vehicle slowly," Wilson ordered, his gun still pointed at Thomas's chest. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Thomas took a deep breath and opened the car door with careful movements. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped onto the pavement, hands raised shoulder high. He stood tall, his military posture impossible to hide even in this humiliating moment. "Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the car," Wilson barked. His voice had an edge to it that Thomas recognized all too well, the sound of someone drunk on their own authority. Thomas complied without argument. He'd faced enough dangerous situations to know when to stay calm. As he placed his palms flat against the cool metal of his car, he could hear cars slowing down as they passed. People were watching now. "Spread your legs wider," Wilson commanded, kicking at Thomas's feet to force them apart. The general felt his cheeks burn with anger and shame. 30 years serving his country, rising to one of the highest ranks possible, and here he was, being treated like a common criminal. "Officer, I'd like to know why I've been stopped," Thomas said, his voice level despite the storm brewing inside him. Wilson snorted. "You were speeding, and your windows are tinted too dark." Thomas knew both claims were false. His car had factory-standard windows, and he'd been driving exactly at the speed limit. This wasn't about traffic violations. "My name is General William Thomas," he said calmly. "I'm returning home from the Pentagon after a long day serving this country. My ID is in my wallet, which you're now holding." "Sure you are," Wilson said with a mocking laugh. "And I'm the Secretary of Defense." He flipped open the wallet but barely glanced at the military ID card visible inside. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. A middle-aged woman was filming with her phone. 2 teenagers had stopped their bikes to watch. An older man stood with his arms crossed, frowning deeply at the scene. "Check the ID," the older man called out. "You've got no cause to treat him like this." Wilson turned and glared at the bystanders. "Stay back. This is police business." Thomas remained silent, his face pressed against the car window now as Wilson roughly patted him down. He thought about his wife, who would be wondering why he was late. About his daughter who had just started college. About the thousands of soldiers under his command who trusted his leadership. The sound of another police siren grew closer. A second patrol car pulled up, lights flashing. Thomas felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Would this make things better or worse? The door of the second cruiser opened and an officer stepped out. He was older, with gray hair visible under his cap. "What's the situation here, Wilson?" the new officer asked, approaching with a measured pace. "Just a routine traffic stop, Lieutenant Baker," Wilson replied, still holding his gun, though it was now pointed at the ground. Subject was uncooperative. Baker looked at Thomas, still facing the car with his hands splayed on the roof. Then his eyes widened with recognition. "General Thomas?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. Thomas turned his head slightly. "Yes, Lieutenant." Baker immediately turned to Wilson. "Holstered your weapon, officer. Now." Wilson hesitated, confused by the change in tone. "Sir, this man was." "I said holstered your weapon," Baker repeated, his voice firm. "That's an order." Wilson reluctantly put his gun away, looking between Baker and Thomas with growing uncertainty. "General, please accept my apologies," Baker said, gesturing for Thomas to turn around and lower his hands. "My son served under your command in the 3rd Infantry Division. He speaks of you with the highest respect." Thomas turned slowly, his dignity returning as he straightened his shirt. The crowd of bystanders had grown larger, their phones capturing everything. "Your son is Corporal Baker?" Thomas asked, his memory instantly recalling the young soldier. "He received a commendation for bravery last year. You should be proud." Baker's face showed genuine admiration. "I am, sir, very proud." He shot a dark look at Wilson, who now stood shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, the reality of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. The woman who had been filming stepped forward. "I've got the whole thing recorded, General. The way he treated you wasn't right." Thomas nodded his thanks, then fixed his gaze on Wilson. The officer could barely meet his eyes now. "I believe you have my identification, Officer Wilson," Thomas said, his voice carrying the natural authority that had guided troops through war zones. Wilson handed back the wallet with trembling fingers. Inside was the ID card he had ignored, showing Thomas's rank, security clearances, and decades of distinguished service to the very country Wilson had sworn to protect. The night air seemed to grow colder as Wilson realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. Lieutenant Baker stepped closer to General Thomas, genuine respect in his eyes. "Sir, I can't tell you how sorry I am about this misunderstanding." Wilson stood awkwardly to the side, his earlier confidence completely deflated. He kept glancing at Thomas's military ID, which he now held in his hand, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "This 2-star general rank, it's real?" Wilson asked, his voice much quieter than before. Baker shot him a look of disbelief. Of course it's real. General Thomas oversees operations for our entire eastern seaboard. He reports directly to the Joint Chiefs. The small crowd of onlookers had grown. A middle-aged man in a veteran's cap stepped forward. "Sir, it's an honor," he said to Thomas, offering a respectful nod. "My nephew is serving under your command. Says you're the finest officer he's ever known." Thomas nodded back, appreciating the support but still feeling the weight of what had just happened. He turned to Wilson, who was now trying to make himself as small as possible. "Officer Wilson," Thomas said calmly, "I understand you have a job to do. But pulling a gun during a routine traffic stop, especially when I made no threatening moves, that's not procedure, that's something else entirely." Wilson opened and closed his mouth, struggling to find words. I mean the way you reached for the glove box." "I told you exactly what I was doing," Thomas replied. "I announced my movements clearly. I was cooperative from the moment you approached my vehicle." More patrol cars had arrived, drawn by the radio chatter. A police captain stepped out of one, quickly assessing the situation. Baker moved to meet him, speaking in hushed tones and gesturing toward Thomas. The captain's eyes widened. He straightened his uniform and walked over. "General Thomas, I'm Captain Reynolds. Please accept my deepest apologies for this incident." He shot a stern look at Wilson. "We'll be conducting a full review of Officer Wilson's actions tonight." Thomas stood straight, his military bearing impossible to miss. "I appreciate that, Captain, but my concern goes beyond just this one incident." Thomas gestured to the growing crowd. How many of these folks have experienced similar treatment but didn't have stars on their shoulders to protect them? How many didn't have bystanders recording? How many didn't have the benefit of another officer arriving who could recognize their value? A woman in the crowd called out, "That's right. My brother gets pulled over at least once a month, driving his own car in his own neighborhood." Reynolds looked uncomfortable but nodded. "I understand your point, sir." Thomas looked at his watch. His family would be worried by now. "I'd like to be on my way, Captain, but I'll be following up on this matter." "Of course, sir." Reynolds turned to Wilson. "Officer, return the General's identification immediately." Wilson handed over the wallet with shaking hands, unable to meet Thomas's eyes. "Sir, I didn't realize." "That's exactly the problem," Thomas cut him off. "You didn't try to realize. You saw what you expected to see, and you acted on that prejudice." His voice remained calm, but carried the weight of authority that had commanded thousands of troops. Baker stepped forward again. "General, would you like an escort home? It's the least we can do." Thomas shook his head. "That won't be necessary, Lieutenant, but thank you." As Thomas turned to return to his car, Wilson finally found his voice. "Sir, will you be filing a formal complaint?" Thomas paused, looking back at the young officer whose face was now pale with fear for his career. "Officer Wilson, I've spent my life protecting this country and everyone in it, including you. Tomorrow morning, I'll be making some phone calls. What happens after that depends largely on what you learned from tonight." The crowd parted respectfully as Thomas walked back to his car. Some nodded in support. Others filmed the entire exchange, their phones capturing what would soon become a viral video across social media. Thomas sat in his car for a moment, collecting himself. Through his rearview mirror, he could see Captain Reynolds reading Wilson the riot act, pointing repeatedly at his body camera. Baker stood nearby, shaking his head in disappointment. As Thomas started his engine, a young boy who had been watching from the sidewalk with his father gave him a small salute. Thomas returned it with perfect military precision, then drove away with dignity. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Everything ok? Dinner's getting cold." Thomas sighed deeply. How could he explain what had just happened? How could he tell her that 30 years of military service, 2 Purple Hearts, and countless commendations couldn't protect him from being treated like a criminal just blocks from their home? He typed back, "On my way. Had a situation. I'll explain when I get there." As he drove, Thomas made a decision. This incident wouldn't just disappear. He would use his position to shine a light on a problem far too many people faced without his resources or rank to protect them. Tomorrow would bring changes. He would make sure of it. By morning, the video had spread like wildfire. Cell phone footage captured by bystanders showed every moment, from Wilson drawing his gun on General Thomas to the arrival of Lieutenant Baker and the stunning revelation of Thomas's identity. Comments flooded in by the thousands, many from veterans who had served under Thomas's command. Police Chief Daniels sat in his office, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he reviewed the body camera footage for the third time. The timestamp showed 3:15 a.m. He'd been called in the middle of the night when the station's social media accounts began blowing up with mentions. The footage was damning. Wilson's camera had picked up every word, including several muttered comments, before he even approached Thomas's vehicle. "Let's see what this guy's story is," Wilson had said to himself, his tone suggesting he'd already made judgments before a single word was exchanged. Chief Daniels rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his phone. This would require immediate action. Meanwhile, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, his wife pouring him a second cup of coffee. He'd barely slept. After explaining everything to his family last night, his teenage son had immediately found the videos online. They'd spread faster than Thomas could have imagined. "What are you going to do?" his wife asked, concern etched on her face. Thomas looked down at his phone. 17 missed calls already this morning, from fellow officers, community leaders, even a state senator. His military training had prepared him for crisis, but not one so personal. "I'm going to make it count," he answered finally. "This isn't just about me." His phone rang again. This time he answered. "General Thomas, this is Chief Daniels from the County Police Department. I can't begin to express how deeply sorry I am about last night's incident." Thomas stepped onto the back porch for privacy. "Chief Daniels, I appreciate your call. Sir, I've reviewed all the footage. Officer Wilson has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. I'd like to meet with you today, if possible." Thomas watched a bird land on the feeder his daughter had built years ago. "I'm free at 11. "Thank you, sir, and the mayor would like to join us, if that's acceptable." 2 hours later, Thomas walked into police headquarters wearing his full dress uniform, stars gleaming on his shoulders. Heads turned as he passed. Some officers nodded respectfully. Others couldn't meet his gaze. Chief Daniels met him in the lobby, hand extended. "General, thank you for coming." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "Let's get to it, Chief." They walked to a conference room where Mayor Phillips waited, along with the department's internal affairs director and legal counsel. The mayor stood immediately. "General Thomas, I want to personally apologize for what happened." Thomas nodded but moved directly to business. "I appreciate that. Now, I'd like to see Officer Wilson's record." The internal affairs director slid a folder across the table. "His complete file, sir." Thomas opened it and began reading methodically. The room fell silent as he turned page after page. Finally, he looked up. 6 complaints of excessive force in 3 years, all filed by minorities, all dismissed for insufficient evidence. His voice remained calm, but carried an edge that made everyone shift uncomfortably. And yet he remained on patrol duty. Chief Daniels cleared his throat. There were no witnesses in those cases, no video evidence. "There is now," Thomas interrupted, "and I suspect this isn't just about Officer Wilson." The mayor leaned forward. "What would you like to see happen, General?" Thomas placed both hands flat on the table. Complete review of all officers with similar patterns of complaints. Mandatory body cameras that cannot be turned off during interactions. Citizen review board with actual power. And immediate sensitivity training led by community members who've experienced profiling firsthand. His voice never raised, but his words carried the weight of command. "That's quite extensive," the legal counsel said nervously. "So is the problem," Thomas replied. Before anyone could respond, Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a news alert with his name in the headline. The story had gone national. "It seems we're on a timeline," Thomas said, showing them the screen. "The Pentagon press office is getting inquiries. So is my office." The mayor and chief exchanged worried glances. "We need to get ahead of this," the mayor said. "A joint press conference, perhaps? Show we're working together." Thomas considered this. "I'm not interested in a photo opportunity, Mayor. I'm interested in real change." "Of course," the mayor replied quickly. "But surely showing unity would help calm the community." Thomas stood up. My calendar is free tomorrow at 2 p.m. If you'd like to announce concrete steps toward reform by then, I'll stand beside you. Otherwise, I'll be speaking to the press alone." As he walked out of the building, Thomas spotted Lieutenant Baker in the hallway. "Thank you for your integrity last night, Lieutenant," Thomas said, stopping briefly. Baker nodded respectfully. "Just did what was right, sir." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, many of us are ashamed of what happened. We want change too." Thomas nodded. "Then help make it happen from within. My influence only goes so far." Outside, a small group of reporters had gathered. Thomas straightened his uniform and prepared to face them. This wasn't a battle he had chosen, but it was one he wouldn't back down from. By noon, the police department's phones wouldn't stop ringing. News vans lined the street outside headquarters, reporters checking their hair in car windows before going live. The story had touched a nerve nationwide. Inside his office, Chief Daniels was reviewing Wilson's complete record with the internal affairs team. What they found disturbed him deeply. "Look at these traffic stop statistics," said the lead investigator, pointing to a chart. "Wilson pulls over minority drivers at 4 times the rate of other officers patrolling the same areas." Daniels shook his head. "And we missed this pattern. The system isn't designed to catch it unless someone specifically looks for it," the investigator admitted. Meanwhile, across town, General Thomas sat in the living room of Mrs. Henderson, an 82-year-old community leader who had called him that morning. "When I saw that video, I knew I had to speak with you," she said, pouring him tea. "My grandson had the same thing happen last year. No cameras, no witnesses, just his word against the officers." Thomas listened intently as 5 other community members shared similar stories. A doctor who was handcuffed in his own driveway. A teacher pulled over twice in 1 week. A college student surrounded by police for matching a description. "The difference is," said the doctor, leaning forward, "none of us had stars on our shoulders to protect us." Thomas nodded solemnly. "That's exactly why I'm here. This can't just be about my experience." His phone buzzed with a text from the mayor. "Press conference at 3 p.m. Announcing major changes. Please join us." Thomas showed the group the message. "Should I go?" Mrs. Henderson smiled for the first time. "You must go, but not alone." At 2:45, General Thomas arrived at City Hall in his full dress uniform. Behind him walked 20 community members of all ages. The security guards looked uncertain, but didn't stop them as they entered the building together. Inside the press room, Mayor Phillips was reviewing his notes when he spotted Thomas and the group. His eyes widened slightly. "General, we weren't expecting guests." Thomas shook the mayor's hand firmly. "These aren't guests, Mayor. These are the people who need to be heard. If we're announcing real changes today, they deserve to witness it firsthand." The mayor hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, we've prepared seats at the front." At exactly 3 p.m., the press conference began. Cameras flashed as the mayor approached the podium, flanked by Chief Daniels, the city council president, and General Thomas. Yesterday, the mayor began, "Our community witnessed an unacceptable incident involving distinguished Army General William Thomas and Officer Peter Wilson. The video evidence is clear and disturbing." Reporters scribbled notes furiously as the mayor continued. "After reviewing body camera footage and Officer Wilson's record, we are taking immediate action." Chief Daniels. The police chief stepped forward. "Officer Wilson has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but we recognize this isn't about one officer. It's about systemic issues that require systemic solutions." He unveiled a list of immediate changes: mandatory bias training for all officers, review of all officers with similar complaint patterns, community oversight board with actual power, and body cameras that couldn't be deactivated during stops. When Thomas stepped to the microphone, the room fell completely silent. "Last night, I was reminded that rank and accomplishment don't shield you from prejudice," he began. "But unlike many citizens who face similar treatment, I had resources and recognition that protected me." He gestured to the community members sitting in the front row. "These neighbors have experienced the same treatment without those protections. Their voices matter just as much as mine." A reporter raised her hand. "General, will you be filing a lawsuit against the department?" Thomas shook his head. I'm not interested in financial compensation. I'm interested in preventing this from happening to anyone else. Another reporter called out, "What about Officer Wilson? Do you think he should lose his job?" Thomas considered this carefully. What Officer Wilson needs most is education, not punishment. However, someone with his record shouldn't carry a badge until he demonstrates real change. At the back of the room, Lieutenant Baker slipped in quietly. When Thomas spotted him, the lieutenant nodded respectfully. After the press conference, as cameras continued to roll, Thomas introduced the mayor and police chief to each community member. Mrs. Henderson shared her grandson's story directly with the chief, who listened with genuine concern. Outside, a group of Thomas's fellow officers from the Pentagon had gathered in support. They stood at attention as he exited City Hall, a silent show of solidarity that spoke volumes. As Thomas walked to his car, a young boy approached him. "Sir, my dad says you're making things better for people like us. Is that true?" Thomas knelt to the boy's level, his stars gleaming in the afternoon sun. "I'm trying. But the real change happens when good people work together, just like in the army." The boy smiled. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Thomas placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Be even better." 3 weeks after the incident, General Thomas stood before a packed community center. People filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled out into the parking lot where speakers had been set up so everyone could hear. The air buzzed with energy and hope. "When I was pulled over that night," Thomas began, "I never imagined we'd be here today." The crowd listened intently as he outlined what had happened since the video went viral. The police department had suspended not just Officer Wilson, but 3 others with similar patterns of behavior. The mayor had signed an executive order creating a civilian oversight board with real power. And most importantly, community members like Mrs. Henderson now had seats at the table where decisions were made. "This isn't about punishing one officer," Thomas continued. "It's about changing a system that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked for years." In the front row sat Lieutenant Baker, now heading the department's newly formed Community Relations Unit. Beside him was Chief Daniels, who had surprised everyone by becoming a genuine ally in reform. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Thomas said. "But it doesn't happen at all unless we demand it." A young reporter raised her hand. "General, there are rumors that Officer Wilson wants to meet with you privately. Is that true?" The room fell silent. This was the question everyone had been wondering about. Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, he's requested a meeting, and I've agreed to it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some looked surprised, others concerned. "Why would you do that?" called out someone from the back. Thomas took a moment before answering. "The same reason I spent 30 years in the military. I believe people can change, and I believe in second chances when they're earned through genuine effort." The next day, Thomas sat in a small conference room at a community center. The neutral location had been his idea. He checked his watch. Wilson was due any minute. When the door opened, Wilson looked different than Thomas remembered. Gone was the swagger, the cockiness. He seemed smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched slightly as he entered the room. "General Thomas," Wilson said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Thomas gestured to the chair across from him. "Have a seat, Mr. Wilson." Wilson noticed the change in address, no longer officer, but said nothing as he sat down. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Wilson began, his voice unsteady. "About that night. About my career. About a lot of things." Thomas remained silent, giving the man space to continue. "I didn't see you that night," Wilson admitted. "I saw what I expected to see. What I was trained to see, maybe." He paused. "That's not an excuse, it's just the truth." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What do you want from this meeting, Mr. Wilson?" Wilson's eyes finally met Thomas. "Not my job back. I know that's over." He took a deep breath. "I want to understand. I want to change. Really change, not just say the right words to get out of trouble." For the next hour they talked, really talked. Thomas shared stories from his career, the slights and suspicions he'd faced even in uniform. Wilson spoke about his upbringing, the neighborhood he'd policed, the fear that had turned to bias. "Fear is no excuse for poor judgment," Thomas said firmly. "Especially when you carry a weapon and wear a badge." Wilson nodded. I know that now. As they were wrapping up, Wilson asked one final question. Do you think there's a place for someone like me to make amends? To actually help fix what I was part of? Thomas considered this carefully. That depends on whether you're willing to listen more than you speak, to learn from the community you harmed, to admit your mistakes publicly and work to correct them. 2 days later, at another community meeting, something unexpected happened. Wilson showed up, not in uniform but in civilian clothes. He sat in the back, just listening. When Mrs. Henderson noticed him, she stiffened. Others turned to stare. The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas approached Wilson. You came. Wilson nodded. You said I needed to listen more than speak, so I'm here to listen. Thomas turned to the crowd. Everyone in this room wants the same thing, a community where we're all treated with dignity. Even those who've made serious mistakes deserve a chance to learn and grow. Mrs. Henderson stood up slowly. If General Thomas can give you a chance to learn, then so can I. She pointed to an empty chair in her discussion group. Come sit with us, young man. You need to hear these stories. That evening, as Thomas drove home, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The incident had been painful, humiliating, even dangerous, but it had created an opening for something important to happen. His phone rang. It was his commanding officer at the Pentagon. General, I've just received word. Your promotion to 3-star has been approved. The ceremony is next month. Thomas smiled. Thank you, sir. And Thomas, his commander added, the work you're doing in that community, it's just as important as anything you've done in uniform. As he pulled into his driveway, Thomas knew this was just the beginning. Real change took time, commitment, and courage from all sides. But for the first time in a long while, it felt possible. 6 months later, the community gathered once again. This time, they met in the newly renamed Unity Park, where children played on fresh equipment while parents chatted on benches nearby. The transformation wasn't just in the park's name, it was in the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. General Thomas, now wearing 3 stars on his uniform, stood near a podium set up for the day's ceremony. He watched as families of all backgrounds mingled freely, including several police officers who had brought their own children to play. Quite a change, isn't it? Mrs. Henderson said, joining him with the help of her cane. At 83, she had become the heart of the Community Oversight Board. Thomas smiled. More than I expected, honestly. That's because you did something rare, she said. You used your privilege to help others instead of just protecting yourself. The mayor approached, extending his hand. General, everything's ready whenever you are. Thomas nodded and followed him to the podium. As he faced the gathering crowd, he spotted familiar faces. Lieutenant Baker, now promoted to captain, Chief Daniels, who had become a national speaker on police reform, and, surprisingly, former Officer Wilson, dressed in civilian clothes and helping distribute water bottles to attendees. 6 months ago, Thomas began. A traffic stop went very wrong just 3 blocks from where we stand today. What could have ended in tragedy instead became a turning point. He outlined the changes that had taken place. Complaints against officers down by 60%, new training programs led by community members, body camera footage now automatically reviewed by a diverse panel, and most importantly, a genuine relationship forming between police and the community they served. Progress isn't measured just in policies, Thomas continued. It's measured in trust, in kids who no longer fear the sight of a patrol car, in officers who know the names of the people they protect. From the crowd, a young boy raised his hand. Thomas smiled and nodded to him. Sir, my dad says you could have just sued the police and gotten rich, but you didn't. Why not? The adults chuckled, but Thomas took the question seriously. Because money doesn't solve problems like this, he answered. Only working together does. And sometimes that means choosing understanding over anger, even when anger would be easier. As the ceremony concluded, Thomas unveiled a simple plaque dedicating the park to a community that chose to build bridges rather than walls. The crowd applauded as a group of children cut the ribbon to the park's new community center. Later, as people enjoyed the celebration, Thomas found himself face to face with Wilson. The former officer had lost weight, and the hardness in his eyes had been replaced with something more thoughtful. I didn't expect to see you here, Thomas admitted. Wilson nodded. I almost didn't come. but I'm working with the youth center now, teaching kids about conflict resolution. He gave a small, ironic smile. Turns out I learned a lot about what not to do. That's valuable knowledge if you use it right, Thomas replied. General, Wilson said hesitantly, I know I can never fully make up for what happened that night. But I want you to know I'm trying to be part of the solution now. Thomas studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. That's all any of us can do. Keep trying to be better. As the sun began to set, Thomas's phone buzzed with a message from the Pentagon. A crisis overseas required his attention. The world didn't stop turning just because one community had begun healing. Before leaving, he sought out Mrs. Henderson one last time. She sat surrounded by her grandchildren, overseeing the festivities like a queen on her throne. Judy calls, he explained. I have to head back to Washington. She took his hand between her weathered palms. You know, when I first saw that video of you being mistreated, I was angry. Then I was hopeful. Now I'm grateful. For what? Thomas asked. For showing us that change is possible, she said simply, even when it seems impossible. On his drive to the airport, Thomas passed the spot where he'd been pulled over that night. It looked so ordinary now, just a stretch of road like any other. Yet it had changed him, changed a community, and perhaps would help change much more. His assistant had already forwarded the briefing documents for the overseas situation. Tomorrow he would be addressing generals and diplomats, making decisions that affected national security. But he knew that what had happened in this small community was just as important as any military operation. Real change rarely came from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Most often, it grew from moments of crisis transformed into opportunities for understanding, one conversation, one policy, one community at a time. As Washington, D.C. appeared on the horizon, Thomas felt the weight of his new third star on his shoulder. The promotion had come with increased responsibility, including a platform to speak about community policing to military bases across the country. He thought about all the young officers, all the community members, all the leaders who might learn from what had happened here. The incident that began with a gun pointed at his chest had ended with hope pointed toward the future. And that, Thomas reflected, was a mission accomplished worth far more than any military victory.